The dense forest was alive with the hum of cicadas and the occasional rustle of leaves as a warm breeze swept through the canopy. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. A lone vulture circled high above, its broad wings cutting through the golden light. Below, a wildlife researcher named Elena moved cautiously through the underbrush, her boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. She had been tracking a rare species of fox for weeks, but today something felt off. The forest was too quiet. Elena paused, her breath shallow as she scanned the trees. The vulture's shadow passed over her and she glanced up, squinting against the sun. It was unusual to see a vulture so low in the forest. They usually stayed near open plains or cliffs. She shook off the unease and pressed on, her camera swinging gently from her neck. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. The air grew heavier, and the light dimmed as the trees thickened. She noticed strange markings on the bark, deep scratches, fresh and raw. Her pulse quickened. These weren't from a fox. A low growl echoed through the trees, too close for comfort. Elena froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the can of bear spray on her belt. The growl came again, this time accompanied by the snap of a twig. She turned slowly, her eyes darting through the shadows. The vulture above let out a harsh, guttural cry, its wings beating loudly as it descended to a nearby branch. Elena's gaze flicked upward, and for a moment she locked eyes with the bird. Its beady, unblinking stare sent a chill down her spine. It was as if the vulture was trying to warn her. She took a cautious step back, her boots sinking into the soft earth. The growl grew louder, more menacing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized she was being stalked. The vulture's cry came again, sharp and urgent, and this time she listened. Elena turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she weaved through the trees. The growl turned into a roar, and the sound of heavy paws pounding the ground behind her spurred her on. She could feel the predator closing in, its breath hot on her neck. Just as she thought she couldn't run any further, the forest opened up into a small clearing. In the center stood an abandoned ranger station, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. Elena sprinted toward it, her legs burning with effort. She burst through the door and slammed it shut behind her, leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. Outside, the predator circled the station, its growls growing more frustrated. Elena's hands trembled as she fumbled with the lock, but the door was too damaged to secure. She backed away, her eyes scanning the room for anything she could use to defend herself. The vulture landed on the roof with a loud thud, its talons scraping against the wood. Elena looked up, her mind racing. Why was the bird still here? What did it want? The predator outside let out a final, furious roar before retreating into the forest. The sudden silence was almost worse than the growls. Elena's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her body shaking with adrenaline. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the clearing in twilight, the vulture took flight once more, its shadow passing over the station. Elena watched it go, a strange sense of gratitude washing over her. The bird had saved her life. But as she sat there in the growing darkness, a new sound reached her ears, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the back room of the station. Her blood ran cold. She wasn't alone. The story ends with Elena rising to her feet, her heart pounding as she approached the source of the sound, the vulture's warning echoing in her mind. The camera pans to the forest outside, where the predator's glowing eyes watch from the shadows, waiting. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience in suspense. Elena's footsteps were barely audible as she crept toward the back room, her hand gripping the bear spray tightly. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly human. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it another researcher, a poacher, or something else entirely? The door to the back room was slightly ajar, and a sliver of dim light spilled through the crack. Elena hesitated, her breath shallow. She pushed the door open with the toe of her boot, the hinges creaking softly. The room was empty. Her eyes darted around, taking in the dusty shelves, the broken furniture, and the shattered window. The tapping had stopped. She stepped inside, her senses on high alert. A faint breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Then she saw it. On the floor, near the far wall, was a small, crude nest made of twigs and leaves. In the center of the nest lay a single bloodied feather. Elena's stomach churned as she knelt to examine it. The feather was large, unmistakably from the vulture that had been watching her. A soft rustling sound came from above. She looked up just as a shadow moved across the ceiling. Her heart leapt into her throat as she scrambled to her feet, backing away from the nest. The vulture dropped from the rafters, landing in front of her with a heavy thud. Its wings spread wide, blocking her path to the door. Elena froze, her eyes locked on the bird's sharp beak and piercing gaze. It tilted its head, studying her with an intelligence that felt almost human. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, the vulture lunged at her. Elena stumbled backward, tripping over a broken chair and landing hard on the floor. The bird let out a harsh cry, its wings beating the air as it loomed over her. But it didn't attack. Instead, it hopped to the side, revealing something hidden in the shadows. A small, trembling fox cub. Its fur was matted with blood, and one of its legs was twisted at an unnatural angle. Elena's breath caught in her throat. This was the fox she had been tracking. The vulture let out another cry, softer this time, and nudged the cub toward her with its beak. Elena's fear melted into understanding. The bird hadn't been stalking her, it had been leading her here. She carefully reached out, her hands trembling as she gathered the injured cub into her arms. The vulture watched her intently, its head cocked to one side. Then, with a final piercing cry, it spread its wings and flew out through the broken window, disappearing into the night. Elena sat there for a moment, holding the cub close to her chest. The forest outside was silent now, the predator gone. She knew she had to get the cub to safety, but as she stood, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. The camera pans to the window where the vulture's silhouette can be seen perched on a nearby tree. Its eyes gleam in the moonlight as it watches Elena carry the cub out of the station. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with a sense of mystery and wonder. The vulture's warning had been real, but its true intentions remain unclear. Was it a guardian of the forest, or something more sinister? The story ends with the question lingering in the air, a haunting reminder of the secrets hidden in the natural world. Elena moved quickly through the forest, the fox cub cradled gently in her arms. Its shallow breaths were warm against her chest, and she could feel its tiny heart racing. The vulture's cry still echoed in her mind, a sound that felt both like a warning and a guide. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the bird following her, but the forest was dark and still. The path back to her campsite was familiar, but the night made it treacherous. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Her flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled roots and low-hanging branches that threatened to trip her. The cub whimpered softly, and she whispered reassurances, though she wasn't sure if she was comforting it or herself. When she finally reached her campsite, she set the cube down on her sleeping bag and began to work. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she cleaned the wound and splinted the broken leg. The cub's eyes fluttered open, wide and fearful, but it didn't struggle. It was as if it knew she was trying to help. As she worked, the forest around her seemed to hold its breath. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls was absent, replaced by an eerie silence. Elena tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it clung to her like a second skin. She kept glancing at the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at her. When she finished tending to the cub, she sat back, her body aching with exhaustion. The fire she had built earlier was down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. She added a few sticks to the fire, coaxing it back to life, and wrapped the cub in a blanket. It curled up against her, its breathing steady now. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax. But then she heard it, a low, guttural growl just beyond the circle of firelight. Her heart skipped a beat, and she reached for the bear spray again. The cub stirred, its ears twitching as it too sensed the danger. The growl came again, closer this time. Elena stood slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. She could feel the predator's presence, a heavy, oppressive weight in the air. And then, from above, came the unmistakable sound of wings. The vulture swooped down, landing on a low branch just outside the firelight. Its head turned sharply, its gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. Elena followed its line of sight and saw them. Two glowing eyes, reflecting the firelight like twin coals. The predator stepped into the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. It was a mountain lion, its muscles coiled like springs, ready to pounce. Elena's grip tightened on the bear spray, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to stop an animal that size. The vulture let out a piercing cry, its wings flapping wildly. The mountain lion hesitated, its eyes flicking between Elena and the bird. For a moment, it seemed like it might retreat. But then it crouched low, its tail twitching as it prepared to strike. Just as the mountain lion lunged, the vulture dove from its perch, screeching and flapping its wings in the predator's face. The big cat swiped at the bird, but the vulture was too quick, darting out of reach and drawing the mountain lion away from the campsite. Elena didn't waste the opportunity. She grabbed the cub and bolted into the trees, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the struggle, the vulture's cries, the mountain lion's snarls, and the crashing of underbrush. She didn't stop until she reached her truck, parked at the edge of the forest. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. She placed the cub gently on the passenger seat and climbed in, slamming the door shut behind her. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The forest was dark and silent once more, the vulture and the mountain lion nowhere to be seen. But she knew the bird was still out there, watching, waiting. The screen fades to black as the truck's headlights disappear down the dirt road. The final shot is of the vulture, perched high in a tree, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. Its head turns slowly, its eyes gleaming as it gazes into the distance. The story ends with a sense of unresolved tension, leaving the audience to wonder about the vulture's true nature. Was it a protector, a harbinger, or something else entirely? The forest. The truck's tires crunched over the gravel road as Elena drove away from the forest, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The fox cub lay curled up on the passenger seat, its breathing steady but shallow. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape was fading, leaving her drained and uneasy. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the vulture's silhouette following her, or the mountain lion's glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. But the road behind her was empty, swallowed by the night. When she reached the small town at the edge of the forest, she headed straight for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The lights were still on, and a kind-faced woman named Mara greeted her at the door. Mara's eyes widened when she saw the injured cub, and she quickly ushered Elena inside. "You did the right thing bringing it here," Mara said as she examined the cub. "It's lucky you found it when you did." Elena nodded, but she couldn't bring herself to explain the full story. The vulture, the mountain lion, the eerie sense of being guided. It all sounded too strange, even to her own ears. Instead, she simply said, "I think it was being hunted." Mara gave her a sympathetic smile. "These woods can be dangerous. You're brave to go out there alone." Elena didn't feel brave. She felt haunted. By the time she left the center, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. She drove back to her cabin on the outskirts of town, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. But as she approached the cabin, something made her stop. Perched on the roof was the vulture. It sat motionless, its head tilted slightly as if watching her. Elena stepped out of the truck, her eyes locked on the bird. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. The morning light caught its feathers, giving them an almost metallic sheen. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the vulture spread its wings and took flight. It circled the cabin once before disappearing into the rising sun. Elena watched it go, a strange mix of relief and unease settling over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the bird had been trying to tell her something she didn't fully understand. Inside the cabin, she collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing. She thought about the cub, the mountain lion, and the vulture's strange behavior. It didn't make sense. Vultures weren't protectors. They were scavengers, drawn to death, not life. And yet, this one had saved her. Twice. As she drifted into a restless sleep, her dreams were filled with shadows and wings. She saw the vulture circling high above, its cries echoing through the forest. She saw the mountain lion stalking her, its eyes glowing like embers. And she saw the cub, its small body trembling as it looked up at her with trusting eyes. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky, and the cabin was filled with light. But the sense of unease lingered. She knew she couldn't leave it alone. She had to go back. The screen fades to black as Elena packs her bag, her face set with determination. The final shot is of the forest, its trees swaying gently in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a vulture's cry echoes through the air. The story ends with a sense of unresolved mystery, leaving the audience to wonder what Elena will find when she returns to the forest. The vulture's warning still hangs in the air, a reminder that the natural world is full of secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered. Elena returned to the forest the next day, her backpack filled with supplies and her mind buzzing with questions. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The air was crisp, and the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves had returned, but the memory of the previous night's events lingered like a shadow. She retraced her steps to the abandoned ranger station, her senses on high alert. The station looked even more decrepit in the daylight, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring out into the forest. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the handle, before pushing it open. The interior was just as she had left it, dusty, cluttered, and eerily silent. She moved to the back room, where the vulture had led her to the fox cub. The nest of twigs and leaves was still there, but the bloodied feather was gone. She knelt beside the nest, running her fingers over the rough edges of the twigs.